Hello there, welcome back to Marcelian Online, and I hope you are sitting down because Death Knight is in shambles, or so the majority of the community seems to believe after the announced rework of Unholy Death Knight. And we're here to talk about it, to figure out exactly how bad is the Unholy rework. Is it a spec that you should be playing in the next patch? Is it a spec that you should be avoiding entirely like the plague, pun intended, because things are not as great with Unholy at the moment. Potentially some things will change as the patch comes closer to release. So let's take a look at the first things that change for Unholy. So if you've missed our Frost Death Knight rework video, may you know that Abomination Limb has gone from the talent tree of Death Knight, and it's now a talent for Unholy, specifically called Legion of Souls, and I'll get to that in a second, because I do have to mention that AMZ has also returned to its old value of providing you damage reduction for magic damage, and that's incredibly amazing because it's a much better defensive cooldown. We'll see how this evolves because we've been here before, and that was what made Anti-Magic Zone change into the damage absorption rather than the damage reduction because it was just way too strong. Now, talking about the first thing that changed, probably the biggest one, and that is Abomination Limb becoming Legion of Souls, which is now a capstone with Raise Abomination. Overall, the functionality of this is really great because it addresses some of the issues that Raise Abomination had when you were supposed to do AoE damage. That part is actually great. There are a couple of issues that I personally have with this. First of all, the grip mechanic of it is completely gone. It just deals damage. It deals quite a bit of damage actually in AoE, where it's one of my biggest damage sources right now, even though Unholy seems a little bit weirdly tuned, but it also applies a lot of festering wounds on the target. And here in turn we come to what the main issue with Unholy is, where a lot of the changes that have been made to it addresses the generation and spending of wounds, or so they say in the developer notes, but it's actually only addressing the generation of wounds, which is something that we 100% did not have a problem with, and I haven't heard of a single Unholy Death Knight complain about that particular part of its playstyle, rather than the actual issue of having wounds as a mechanic to play around that's completely boring, archaic, and not fun, essentially. But moving back to this, Legion of Souls probably essentially means that you will never, ever use Army of the Dead ever again, and that is just a blow to the fantasy of Unholy DK for completely removing a very iconic ability that was very impactful visually and had the flavor of the spec all the way to Wrath of the Lich King when the spec was introduced, because Army of the Dead on its own just doesn't do anything anymore. You'll always either use your Abomination or your Legion of Souls depending on the tuning and the encounter that you are in. Now, potentially a good change in theory is the change to Death and Decay, or rather Desecrate, which is now a capstone with Defile, where you want to choose either one of the two. What Desecrate does is after you cast your Death and Decay, you actually have a new button to press, which is your old Death and Decay button, that is called Desecrate. Reactivating the ability makes it squeeze your enemies to do insignificant tiny little damage to them, and also apply 2 festering wounds to all of them. I think the number of targets it applies festering wounds to could be capped. I wasn't able to test that much. It's a great way to apply festering wounds and start your rotation, but it does add a new button where it takes another button away from another part of your rotation, which is Apocalypse, that now replaces your Dark Transformation. Again, kind of weird because it attacks the fantasy of Unholy DK. Some people might like it because you have fewer buttons to press, especially in your opener. But from some of the theory crafters of Unholy DK and from some of the Unholy DKs that are playing at high end, you sometimes don't want to use Apocalypse and Dark Transformation at the same time. So taking away the choice of players being able to use these differently as they see fit can be a problematic choice and not something that I am personally a fan of. And because we've had all of this, we also lost Vile Contagion, and in its place Festering Scythe was moved to make room for a few other new talents, some of them that are particularly boring. One of them being just down below Dark Transformation, a choice note between Plague Mastery and Grave Mastery. Plague Mastery makes critical strike damage of your diseases be increased by 25%. Grave Mastery makes critical strike damage of your minions be increased by 15%. As far as I understand it, by looking into the Death Knight community, particularly one Theory Crafter's opinions, which we will talk about this by the end, There's a problem with critical strike for Unholy DK, and I cannot really deny that, since when was the last time you ever wanted crit strike on an Unholy in the last 3 expansions? So this is probably an attempt to fix that particular issue, but from an average player's perspective as myself, it creates a different kind of issue where it's not very clear what I'm supposed to be building as an Unholy DK, because this being a choice node, it clearly only affects minions or only affects diseases, fueling a potential fantasy of the Unholy Death Knight where you want to make a disease build or you want to make a minion build. The problem with this is that diseases are just so integral to Unholy's kit. You have way more talents that improve diseases than you have minions, even if you do want to just go for strict minions. If you do want to go for strict minions and not for diseases, then taking disease empowering talents becomes counterintuitive, and if you don't take disease empowering talents like Fallen Infections, you forego the left side of the talent tree completely, because there's no other way to get to that talent tree, even though there are talents there that increase the damage of your minions, again, which is Unholy Blight. So you have a talent that gives you a choice between empowering your minions or your diseases. If you want to pick the minions one, you still have to pick a talent that empowers your diseases to pick a talent that empowers your minions. So that is just a little bit counterintuitive for any new Unholy DKs that want to build their spec and try to make their fantasy come alive. Not to mention that the tuning differences between diseases and minions is so off scale that it doesn't really ever make sense to go full minions unless I'm missing some crucial piece of information. A couple of minor other changes happened to the talent tree, which I will address in the issue section of this tree, because I do have to talk a little bit about Sand Lane as well, where the Blood is Life beast has been changed. And this is actually a good change, where now the Blood is Life makes it so that Dark Transformation summons your Blood Beast to attack an enemy for 10 seconds. The Blood Beast has been nerfed generally across the board for both Blood and Unholy, but it makes it so that it's no longer an RNG proc off of your Vampiric Strike, completely changing the degenerate rotation of Unholy Death Knight of spamming Vampiric Strike no matter what happened in the end. Whether or not this translates into a much more fun playstyle of Sand Lane, we will need to have the final version of this rework in our hands and proper content on the PTR to test it with, and we will have a video on that when that becomes available. Now we come to the issues of Unholy DK, and I will go through my personal issues as a Death Knight fan, that I see it as an average player that plays all of the specs in the game and occasionally wants to dabble into Unholy and realizes, oh my god, what is actually going on with this spec? I'm not going to go through it again with the Plague Mastery with the minions versus diseases one, but I will talk about the wounds situation, where wounds seems to be a resource that you need to take into your kit no matter what happens, no matter how you build on it, and wounds are essentially a disease part of the talent tree situation, where to get wounds you need to fuel into your diseases, and if you start to put talent points into your diseases, you'll want to put more talent points into your diseases, especially the Plague Mastery choice node talent, making the minion build feel a little bit awkward. The change to all will serve, where now your minion that you spawn does shadow damage, essentially just doing shadow damage that doesn't get affected by the enemy's armor, now has blighted arrows, where if you fire a death coil, it fires a blighted arrow, an extra attack essentially, and if you fire epidemic, it fires a blighted arrow that ricochets onto 5 targets, says the tooltip in game, even though their developer notes stated that it's 3 targets, so it's not very clear how many enemies you're supposed to be able to be hit with this. I would imagine it's 5 targets. That is the usual soft AoE cap on small abilities. The wounds essentially is just a weird mechanic where playing with the wounds talent makes so that wounds are no longer an issue that you particularly engage with, because you just generate so many and you pop so many that you don't actively have to look out for engaging with the mechanic. And if you don't take the wounds talent, you essentially have no wounds generation or synergy whatsoever, so you have to super actively focus on. So there doesn't seem like to be a middle ground. There might be a situation where you might not be playing talents like Infected Claws because it just doesn't warrant the extra wound generation, and it might cause a situation where talents might become dead. Decomposition as a talent is essentially still dead, judging from what the community has been mathing about this particular value of the talent. It would need about a 900% increase in its damage to be competitive with Fester Might, which is on the other side of the talent tree. We still have issues with Gargoyle, where it just doesn't seem to be able to be playable, even though it's an iconic Unholy Death Knight ability that we still hope that will be made more integral to its part. Maybe it's time to make Gargoyle baseline, so we don't have to worry about spending a talent point for it, although that might make it mandatory for people to play it, which might not make it something that they would like. And now we come to the actual feedback of the community. For anybody that's interested in going deeper into the issues of Unholy, you will check the article that we linked in the description for Taznak. You've seen it over the years in our podcast for Unholy. He's one of the most passionate men of Unholy that you have out there, and one of the main people responsible for you having a good Unholy Death Knight build that you can actually play and figure out exactly how this works. Overall, this is a big miss. A lot of the problems that Unholy didn't have been addressed apparently, and a lot of the issues that it did have for way too many expansions have been addressed. So what this means is we will have an update for this as soon as these get addressed. Hopefully, if not, it's looking pretty grim for Unholy players coming to the new patch, but at least you can check our Frost Death Knight rework right here, where things are looking better because Breath of Sindragosa is almost a new ability that will change how you look at it and potentially make you a Frost Death Knight main in 11.2.